Deputy Director of the Southeast Asia Program at the Stimson Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's discussion on the state of politics in the Philippines. So we're going to give people just a minute or two to come in from the waiting room and get connected, and we'll begin very shortly. All right, and I see we're still getting a trickle of people coming in from the waiting room, so thank you all for joining today. Please hang tight. We're going to get started probably about 2 minutes after the hour once we've had everyone get connected from the waiting room. So in the meantime, my name is Courtney Weatherby. I'm Deputy Director and Research Analyst with the Southeast Asia Program at the Stimson Center, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to today's discussion. I'm very shortly going to turn things over to Bill Weiss to moderate today's discussion. But just as a reminder to all of you who are joining today's webinar, we are going to have a Q&A with the audience for the latter portion of the discussion. So if at any point during today's discussion you have a question or a comment, please feel free to go ahead and type them into the Q&A function. I will be moderating that, and I will jump back on after our panelists finish speaking to go ahead and help bring those questions into the discussion. So with that said, I think we're starting to slow down on the trickle of new people coming into the room. So Bill, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you to get started, and I look forward to today's discussion.
Great, and thank you very much, Courtney, and good afternoon to everybody on the East Coast, and good morning to our audience on the West Coast and in Hawaii, and a good very early morning to our friends in Southeast Asia who may have joined us at a very early hour. Wherever you are, we're certainly glad to have you joining us at the Southeast Asia Forum's Philippines Roundtable event on the Philippine political landscape a year ahead of the 2022 presidential election. As Courtney said, my name is Bill Wise. I chair the Southeast Asia Forum and the Philippines Roundtable at the Stimson Center. The Southeast Asia Forum is a project of the Southeast Asia program at Stimson. We are here to promote the study of Southeast Asia and U.S. Southeast Asia relations at colleges, universities, and research institutions in the mid-Atlantic region of the U.S., but also, thanks to Zoom, quite beyond. The Philippines Roundtable is a policy research discussion group sponsored by the Southeast Asia Forum in partnership with the U.S. Philippines Society. We're hosted by the Stimson Center, but we're entirely self-supporting. And in that respect, we're very grateful to Henry Howard, member of our advisory council, and to 2 anonymous donors for supporting our twice monthly webinars. You in the audience can assist our work by becoming a friend of the forum. More information about this is available on our web pages at the Stimson Center website. Today, our topic is the Philippine political landscape a year ahead of the 2022 presidential election. We're looking at the political present to better understand the political future. Because in slightly less than 12 months, on May 9th, 2022, the Philippines will hold its 17th direct presidential election since 1935. President Rodrigo Duterte is term limited. His successor will be the 7th president elected for a 6-year term since 1986. Of course, we understand that presidential elections in the Philippines and elsewhere are about power, who gets it, and how the winners use it to reward family, clan, clique, region, and domestic political allies, and to punish political opponents. We know we must take care not to project onto the Philippines what we know about politics and elections in other countries. In the coming months, as the election in the Philippines nears, we plan seminars to examine the candidates and their circumstances and to go into some depth on the details of the election. Perhaps we will even entice our guests for those sessions to handicap the outcome of the voting. But today, at this very early stage in the electoral process, we will survey the political landscape in the Philippines. What will be President Duterte's legacy? Is it transferable? What's on the minds of Philippine voters a year ahead of the election? What is motivating partisans of all stripes? And of course, very important, what are the policy influencers among the country's elites thinking Americans like to say, or more precisely, the winners of American elections like to say, elections have consequences. So we wonder, is the 2022 presidential election in the Philippines likely to have consequences beyond the narrow interests of the candidates and their followers? For our academic and research community, this is a core question. Does the state of politics and the 2022 presidential election really matter? For example, how might the 2022 presidential election affect the development of the Philippine state, of society, or the economy? Will it impact on the nation's security? What might the consequences for the region, including ASEAN, Japan, and China be? For us, a key question, will there be implications for US-Philippine relations? We have two very distinguished experts to guide us through the political landscape, and I will introduce them in just a moment. First, I need to make three important points. First, this event is on the record. Second, the event is being recorded and will appear on the Southeast Asia Forum web pages at the Stimson website. And finally, after our speakers have made their remarks, we'll have a brief moderated conversation followed by a Q&A session with our audience. Please use the Q&A function to pose your questions. Courtney will collect, organize, and ask the questions to our speakers. So, our first speaker is Professor Patricio Abinales. He grew up in northwestern Mindanao and now teaches in the Asian Studies program at the University of Hawaii. He's a highly respected analyst of Philippine politics and specializes on insurgencies, the illicit sector, warlords, and clans. He's the author of numerous books, book chapters, and academic articles on these and related issues. Professor Abinales, we're really pleased to have you here today, all the way from Hawaii. Thanks for joining us. We're looking forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Professor Weiss, and good morning, everyone. It's 7 o'clock in the morning in Hawaii, so time, just to adjust for the time frame. Thank you for inviting me. I would have wanted to go to DC at this time of the year, beautiful weather, but we're stuck here because of COVID. Let me start my discussion with just mentioning 5 points. Then I can elaborate later on when we do a Q&A and discussion. So, number one, the next president will probably be still a local strongman or strongwoman with the potential to match President Duterte's popularity. That's the first one. Second, money politics will rule. In fact, it's much more expensive to run campaigns now. I'll explain later. Family alliances are crucial in bringing in the votes, but the most critical region in terms of really changing deciding the game is in Muslim Mindanao. Number three, the drug war may be an issue, but it is a variation. It depends on where it is. And I think Sheila can talk about the drug war. They have a project as to where this is located. In regions where there is less killing, I think it will be less of an issue. But what I think is an important issue will be how local elites deliver health services. And COVID has completely changed the way elites relate to people. Number four, there will continue to be sustained economic growth. Filipinos will still leave the country. I think it's 4,000 a day after COVID, because and send remittances that would increase through the years. The business processing operations center, the call centers, will also grow, and this is where much of the employment will come from, and bring about economic growth. It has political implications. Okay. Number five, China is actually not an issue. It is not. It may be. It's not a security issue. And in fact, when it comes to soft power, the Chinese and the Filipinos, the Philippine government are actually working together well. The threat is internal. It still comes from the Communist Party of the Philippines, which is in the doldrums at the moment, and I can explain that later. And Islamic fundamentalist terrorism in the Philippine South in Mindanao, which is a strange animal because it overlaps with the illicit sector and clan power. So those are the 6 points actually that I'd like to introduce to the audience today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Abinales. You've given us some really interesting topics to focus on. Let's turn now to our next speaker. Sheila Coronel is a dedicated, courageous, and prize-winning Philippine journalist. With colleagues, she founded the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism in 1989 and has been training investigative reporters for a considerable period of time. She's currently professor of professional practice in investigative journalism and director of the Tony Stabile Center for Investigative Journalism at Columbia University in New York. She joins us from there, I believe. Ms. Coronel, welcome to the Southeast Asia Forum's Philippines Roundtable.
Thank you, Bill. I'll try to match Giorgio's 6 points, but I don't know if I have that many. But let me just say that I think the 2022 elections will be a moment of reckoning for democracy in the Philippines. Since 2016, we've seen the erosion of our freedoms. The anti-terror law is only the latest in a series of attempts to really clamp down on civil liberties, on the media, on civil society. We've also seen how the courts have been weaponized to neutralize critical critics, to neutralize actually any opposition to the government. We've also seen the weakening and the politicization of the institutions of accountability, the courts, the Office of the Ombudsman. Congress is no longer a check on executive power. There is no real opposition there. Opposition is either out of office or in jail. There's been a flood of disinformation and propaganda that have really neutralized the attempts to have dissenting voices in the larger information landscape. And to me, the most worrisome in terms of long-term effects and impacts on Philippine democracy is the empowerment of the police and the military. Empowerment because of the drug war and the current heightened campaign against the insurgency. So I think what we saw in the last 5-6 years has been an autocratic breakthrough in the Philippines. To me, the question for this election, depending on the balance of power, who wins the presidency, the Senate, and Congress, is whether there will be an authoritarian consolidation. So this will be a very different elections from those in the past for many reasons. One is the pandemic, and not only because the pandemic itself and the response to it and the competence of both local and national elites to deliver public health services, not only because of that, but we will be campaigning during a pandemic. So there will be really restrictions on the ability of people to go out, to be able to gather, to organize, to meet. Second, it's different is the overwhelming advantage of the incumbent. We have probably the weakest opposition ever since 1986, and the playing field is really uneven. Not only does the incumbent have 3 branches of government under control, it also has immense resources under its control. The weakness of the opposition is partly not just because of its showing in 2019, but because as of today, it hasn't been able to coalesce around a single candidate. So it's really losing precious time in terms of coming up with an alternative to the incumbents in power. My other point about why this is different is we are doing this election in the shadow of a very violent war on drugs and a very violent counterinsurgency campaign. During the drug war, there's been a national network of surveillance at the barangay level that has been used to surveil criminals, now insurgents, dissidents, community pantries, everyone. So there is a lot of fear and a lot of surveillance. The use of the barangay structure as a weapon for state control has never been, not since the Marcos era, as been so obvious or so entrenched. I think we have suffered from the last 5 years from a lot of state-sponsored or state-endorsed violence. and that will certainly cast a shadow on this election. And whether there will be continuing support for such violence as the first rather than the last recourse to social problems, be it drugs, insurgency, or whatever, is I think what is at stake also in this election. Finally, I think we have real worries about election integrity. Over the past five years, really the independence of the COMELEC, the Commission on Elections, which is the ultimate arbiter of election disputes, is really now very much in doubt. The police and the military are very partisan. You know, everybody fist bumps with Duterte. Nobody, even the Supreme Court justice. So there's no more any illusion of nonpartisanship on the institutions that are supposed to guard the integrity of the elections. I also see that the anti-communist campaign is going to be the cover to unleash violence and terror on communities that are likely to vote for non-clan and platform-oriented, progressive-minded politicians, not just connected to the CPP, but broadly to the left and the left of center. So we may be seeing, I'm sorry, that's the New York sound. If you hear it, that's my soundtrack. But I know I've seen Giorgio's presentation. I know he will talk about how money is paramount now, not violence. So we will not see the clan rivalry violence in the past, but we will actually see agents of the state using insurgency and crime as an excuse to advance partisan political ends, because the AFP and the PNP have right now been so politicized and really being used very much by the current government. Finally, about South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea, I disagree with Giorgio. I think it will be an issue. So it's not a security issue, but it will be an election issue, with people choosing to distance themselves from Duterte or to be very different from Duterte, like Manny Pacquiao, for example, will be using his perceived kowtowing to China as a campaign part of the campaign platform. And certainly the relationship with China is something that is up in the air depending on who wins the election. Finally, I'm beyond my 5 minutes. Finally, this election will be also an election on whether populist appeals to the electorate will continue and what type of populist appeals. So Duterte has basically used the Iron Man, I'm in charge, I'm going to kill you if you object, that kind of strongman appeal. Manny Pacquiao, who's a boxer, is trying to resurrect the sort of movie star, celebrity type of populist appeal that has won in the past. You know, we had Joseph Estrada and several people elected to the Senate because of their celebrity, the charisma of celebrity. So the question is, will this type of populism, will it be movie star populism or strongman populism, which will prevail? And then what is the opposition? Because we don't know yet, because there's no opposition candidate. What will be the opposition's answer to the populist appeals of celebrities and of strongman? That to me is the question. So there's a lot of uncertainty still in this election, and Philippine elections have always had uncertain outcomes. You know, Duterte was not a foregone conclusion. I know that Giorgio says that it will likely be a local strongman. I am open to other possibilities in this coming election. So thank you.
I am uncharacteristically slow in unmuting myself, and I apologize for that, but thank you so much for that really interesting approach to what the political landscape is about. You've each talked, and I want to start locally, but eventually move to a question to each of you about if there is any place for consideration of U.S.-Philippine relations in the present electoral landscape. But before we get there, just to clarify, Professor Abinales has said that the next president will be probably in the Duterte mold in terms of being a strongman. And you have, Ms. Coronel, you have taken a slightly different view that maybe this issue is not quite settled. So my question to each of you, thinking about what the other has said, is how do you perceive the political, economic, and security legacy of the Duterte administration? Is this something that the incumbent is attempting to transfer to, shall we say, another candidate, or is he stepping back and not responsible for the strongman approach? Another way of saying that is the for Professor Abinales, is this interest in having a strongman a function of local politics in the Philippines, or is this something that the current administration is actively promoting? And for Professor Coronel, if the same question, is this something that is simply that bubbles up from below in the Philippines, or maybe from above, or is it something that the current administration is trying to promote? Start with Professor Abinales.
Thank you, Professor Professor Weiss. Well, my point, my sort of leading is towards the idea that a local politician would become president. It's based on this. Let me show you a screen that I prepared on. Can I share it? And this is this one. If you look at the number of people and people who are located in critical offices, the most important one are always the governors. The governors and the mayor allies are the ones that deliver the votes. And if you notice, that's a big chunk of people who are now in control of local offices. This is strengthened by the fact that the House of Representatives, which is extremely a local oriented, it's not a national thing, it's not a body that thinks nationally, still a big number of this. Okay. And so anybody who runs for political office will have to negotiate with these people, with these local officials and the families that back them, or the family itself. So that is the most crucial thing. I got this from Professor Mendoza and Ateneo. In 1988, there were only 19% of elected officials coming from political families. In 2019, it's 29% and increasing. Okay, and the way political clans now resolve differences is not so much to kill each other during elections, but actually to share the wealth. So the number of provinces that have opened up, the provinces that have been subdivided, is based entirely on how political families, clans within the family, or another family coming up would resolve issues. And so I think that's the sort of reason why I think a local politician would do better than someone like Manny Pacquiao. Manny Pacquiao has the money, but the first time he ran for office was in General Santos' town, and he lost. He gave everybody he gave everybody $500, and everybody said, "Sure, thank you very much, but we're voting for the old family because you're just a boxer, you're not a politician." So I think he would have the money, but the ones that will deliver the votes are the local families, and they will deliver the votes based on how the kind of relationship they've had with the presidential candidate. Sheila?
I don't disagree. I mean, elections in the Philippines have largely been, clan-based elections. It's rent-seeking families, both at the national and local level, coalescing around or fighting among each other. Certainly at the national level, we see these rent-seeking families, the Dutertes, the Villars, the Marcoses, the Binays, the Arroyos, the Cayetano. We will see this in 22, and a large part of who will be the emerging frontrunners will be determined by how these families form coalitions with each other. It's more like family coalitions rather than party coalitions. But at the same time, these there's also within there's certain junctures in our elections when the moneyed candidates, we've seen this before with the defeat of the Venetia, we've seen this with the defeat of machine and money politics in favor of more populist, like Duterte, for example. I classify him as that. Estrada, Duterte. Eventually, the families then decide where their interests are. They're very opportunistic, and that it's not always in Philippine elections that those with the most money and the most families behind them win. I am not sure, however, that this election will be an exceptional election. So I'm thinking that at the national level, populist appeals still matter. Although I will also say that families and money also matter equally. But it's never a done deal, I think.
Yeah, so there are many components and they interact with each other in ways that sometimes are unpredictable.
Yes.
Let me switch from the local to the international quite suddenly and point out that you disagree slightly about the salience of China as an election issue, as something that captures China and the South China Sea, as something that captures the interest of Philippine voters, but neither of you mentioned US-Philippine relations. And because of where some of us are sitting, I have to ask you, is there a role, if anything, for US-Philippine relations as an election consideration? And in thinking about that, are there things that the Biden administration might do, perhaps in the area of vaccine diplomacy, to influence, to affect, shall we say, voter views? Are there things that President Duterte might do that would change the role of the US? Or is, in fact, the late Tip O'Neill right that all politics are local and these great international issues that consume so many people in Washington are not very consequential at all? Let me start with Professor Abinales.
I think if you look at it, base it only on the rhetorics of President Duterte, the Philippines seems to be strongly pro-China and anti-US. But if you look at the kind of relationship the Philippine military has with the American military, then you will know how strong, how still important, at least the eyes of the military, how important that alliance is. It has worked well against Abu Sayyaf, for example, and now it's shifting towards a kind of relationship where the Philippine military, which is a rural counter-insurgency force, is now being, trained by American soldiers on the art of urban warfare. So Americans, despite whatever rhetoric is happening there in the civilian leadership, doesn't have an impact, or has little impact on the most important component of that relationship, the military relationship. Second, the US remains the largest trading partner of the Philippines. And therefore, if you think about where Filipino corporations, companies, and where American companies interact with each other, that's very important. Number three, there's almost 2 million Filipinos in the United States, okay? And I suspect that Filipinos in the other diasporas remain extremely pro-American. So there is moral social influence there that to keep that relationship together. And my thinking is Duterte can go rant about China against the US, but at the end of the day, Filipinos would say, yeah, he's a politician, That doesn't affect the fact that when it comes to containing the Abu Sayyaf, the US has played an important role. Oh, and another point, USAID quietly has been helping in the rehabilitation of Mindanao. That doesn't end up in the headlines, but it's been working well. So as I mentioned in the past, when you go to these war zones, if you're American, you don't get kidnapped. If you're not American, then you get kidnapped. In fact, partly because of the success of USAID efforts in these parts of the Philippines.
And Professor Coronel?
I mean, I don't disagree with anything that George has said. What I would just like to point out is that in terms of China and the US, Duterte is kind of twisting himself in knots here, right? So he tries to he said China is not a problem. He's allowed Chinese vessels, that's like 200 of them, to be out in the Spratlys. And at the same time, he's very anti-American, even if he's asking for the Americans' help. So at some point, there's going to be some dissonance here. And clearly his enemies, he's in a hotly contested election. And even now, you see people like Justice Carpio, Manny Pacquiao, and other people using this as a wedge to knock out to shave off points from Duterte's popularity. So it will be an election issue, even if in the end, what will remain is US military assistance is going to be Philippine military is going to be very dependent on that. But the other side of that is that Duterte is using this counterinsurgency anti-red campaign to win back the military and give that as a sort of exchange for his kowtowing to China. So there's a relationship with how the Duterte's anti-communist campaign is really to appease the military that is upset about his refusal to stand up to China in asserting Philippine sovereignty over the contested islands in the South China Sea. So there is an impact. The foreign posturing, the kowtowing to China, has an impact on domestic politics and domestic military-civilian relations.
Very, very interesting. And thank you both for your comments and your observations. It's time now for us to turn to our audience. You are being the best of audiences and filling up our Q&A box very rapidly. So let me turn without another word to Courtney Weatherby and ask her to moderate the Q&A.
Yes, and in the interest of trying to get through questions, since there are a few that have overlapping questions or overlapping areas, I'm going to combine a few of these as I ask them to the panelists. So I'm going to start with some of the questions focusing on domestic situation in the Philippines and then end with sort of the international questions and continue the conversation that was just had. So the first question is, how critical a role will religious politics play in the 22 election? So we had a couple people specifically picking up on the point that Professor Abinales made about the importance of Muslim Mindanao. So I'm curious if you can specifically elaborate on Muslim Mindanao's importance, and then also broadly the role of religious groups such as the Catholic Church and other Muslim groups in the Philippines. So I think let's start with Professor Abinales and then turn to Sheila.
So let me focus on Mindanao and just give you how complicated things are. Again, I prepared the slides, so let me share this with you. There you go. Share that. Okay, so the picture you get is that certain parts of Mindanao, in certain parts of Mindanao, you have these 4 groups operating. Right? That's given. What's different with this group is this. Okay. Let me see. Sorry. That group, sorry. What the difference between this group are the following. One, it's actually completely different from the way Islamic groups, separatist groups in the past fought. It's it use asymmetric tactics, IED, etc. But unlike the other groups, these 4, the more National Liberation Front and the more Islamic Liberation Front, these groups have the illusion, I guess, the dream that to turn Mindanao into a caliphate. That's the first thing. But what makes things difficult, so in terms of religion, you can see people see the upsurge of Islamic fundamentalism. My argument is Philippine Islam is still very resilient to resist that. I'll come back to that later. What makes things more complicated is this. Okay, if you look at the Marawi crisis in 2019, it took 5 months for the military to dislodge, an ISIS-supported group in Marawi City. Okay. What is less said is that some of those people, some of the fighters involved in defending Marawi against armed forces come from this. And in fact, the kind of violence you have in Mindanao is on the shadow economy. Okay. Let me just continue with that and go back to religion later. Okay. So if you notice, Mindanao has shifted away from identity issues, okay, shadow economy issues, which means drugs, trade, guns, human trafficking, have become a source of tension and conflict in Mindanao. Now, if you add this, clan power, going back to ISIS, you will notice not only that certain families dominate the local politics in Lanao del Sur, where the Marawi crisis happened, but this one is actually fascinating. These two brothers, okay? And what I'm arguing is that the reason why Islamic fundamentalism, at least in Lanao del Sur, is sustained because it derives money from the illicit trade, but also from the local politicians. This is what I thought was Kevin Bacon's X degrees of separation between local politicians, national politicians, rebel groups, and gangsters. Okay, and in fact, this I would argue that to completely understand what happened in Mindanao, the most critical one to look at are these two groups. Okay, let me just elaborate. These are two brothers. This is the son of Salek, who is married to the wife of the Maoti, whose wife is a relative of the Maoti groups, the ISIS group. So these two brothers and their handler from Abu Sayyaf have been eliminated. What's interesting are this. So they have connections with, but also connections because of relatives to this, such that you have Omar Solitario. He's a former rebel, our local mayor. He lost the elections. He is in Duterte's hit list, but the Office of the President for Peace Process have asked him to negotiate with the ISIS group during that crisis. Okay. Now the brother is not involved in the rebel movement, but is completely connected. Is connected to three groups involved in the illicit sector. So the question you ask then is, how do you deal with these overlapping identities that help sustain in a certain way Islamic fundamentalism in Mindanao? So, so that's sort of the complicating answer that I wanted in response to the question of religion. Sheila?
Yes, I mean, the Catholic Church, since Georgia talked about Islam, I'd like to talk about the Catholic Church, which has, been, at least some very vocal members of it, has really been the voice of opposition to many of the human rights violations during the Duterte administration. And they certainly have the resources and the moral, much diminished moral and political influence, but they will be a factor. I mean, several of them, of the liberal Catholic clergy, are involved in the Sambayanan coalition, which is trying to get the opposition together to agree on a single candidate. So yes, the church will be there as it has in the past, in both, openly campaigning against candidates that have been linked to human rights abuses, and also in voter education and in guarding the vote. Those have been traditionally the roles that the Catholic Church has played. And they will be there for sure very actively in 2022.
I just want to add that, when politicians run for power, I slightly disagree with Sheila on this. Catholic vote is not really crucial. What's crucial is the Iglesia ni Cristo vote, okay, and the votes of Christian fundamentalist groups. The two most popular of whom El Shaddai, Jesus is Lord movement, Rising, are extremely pro-Duterte groups. So I
Yeah,
think
you're right. The Catholics don't vote as a bloc.
blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
So the question is, when it comes to which candidate can appeal to Iglesia ni Cristo and the two other large fundamentalist groups.
I think you can see that the difference between Giorgio and me is that Giorgio stresses, for the purposes of the discussion, the structural constraints, and I'm trying to look more at the conjunctural opportunity. So we balance each other out.
I think that makes for an interesting discussion. So moving to our next sort of set of questions, we had a number of people sort of raising the importance of the COVID pandemic and then the recovery from the pandemic politically inside the Philippines. So looking at sort of the economic impacts, the human impacts on people in the Philippines who have suffered through lockdowns and the global economic slowdown. What impact do you think COVID-19 and the government's response to COVID-19 have had on perceptions of Duterte? And is it possible for the opposition to build on missteps? And sort of within that context, globally, everyone suffered through the pandemic. Nobody's really sort of in living memory suffered through a crisis like the coronavirus. So is it broadly impacting state and society and elections more, in the Philippines leading up to it, anticipating that most will not have had vaccines, but there will still be lockdown and still be health concerns? How do you think it will impact the elections themselves? So this question is broad, so I'm happy to let whoever wants to speak first jump in.
Sheila?
Yeah, well, COVID has certainly been used as an excuse, and Duterte is not alone in this, to clamp down further. His response to quarantine violators and to the COVID problem itself is to treat it like a law and order problem. The problem is quarantine violators. It's not seen as a public health issue. And so the institutions that were mobilized initially to deal with the pandemic were the police, the military, not the social workers. And in fact, in the beginning, the social workers were told to stay home. And the pandemic really showed the weaknesses of the public health system, but it also provided an opportunity for some local politicians to be able to show that they were able to deliver. So because service delivery is very localized, I am not sure that Duterte himself is going to be blamed for the lack of services. I'm not sure. I haven't been to the Philippines since the pandemic. The last time I was there was January of 2020. So I don't have a sense for what it's like on the ground. But I think that it's possible that in many parts of the country, the blame is being put on local officials who are unable to deliver health services and to provide support, aid and support to their constituents. At the same time, I think as people look around them, and they probably are going to do that, and definitely if you're in the opposition, you're going to take advantage of this, the very incompetent response and Duterte's initial statements about the pandemic, saying, Filipinos have natural immunity, we shouldn't bar people from China, that this will pass, or that he even said something like, there's always pandemics in human history, there was the plague, and so we can't do anything about it. So this statements, I don't know if people will remember, but certainly it will be something. It will be part of the election. It will be part of the way in which anti-Duterte politicians will want to separate themselves from Duterte. To show, I think the opposition line, not just the opposition, but even Manny Pacquiao, is that they will have a more competent, more compassionate, and more effective government. I think the pandemic put the lie on, showed the government's incapacity very starkly, very dramatically, but whether Duterte himself will be blamed for that is another question.
During the Soviet Union, at the height of the purges, when peasants and cadres were being killed, one of the things they always said was, if only Stalin knew, which means Stalin never knew about what's happening below. And I think that's going to be the attitude of Filipinos towards Duterte, if only he knew. criticism of COVID will be local. This family messed things up. If you go around and be talking to people back home and they say, well, yeah, Duterte is far away. It's this governor that's really messing things up. One of the fascinating things, however, and this seems to be a pattern now, is to assuage local voters, local politicians invest on healthcare. Okay. There is actually, I haven't had time to look at it, but during certain elections, 2008, for example, the number of ambulances that Manny Pacquiao gave to different village department was very crucial in getting him to be voted in this new province where he moved. And there is news now that different local governments are, investing on MRI machines, new hospitals, and promoting nurses, and so that's where probably things will happen, and the kind of elections. That's how COVID would influence the kind of local elections that are going to happen in 2022.
Let me just say that during the drug war, a lot of the local government resources were put into surveillance and anti-drug programs and everything. So you could see, because I went around many barangays in 2017 and 2018, and they would post the barangay budgets in the barangay hall, and you would see that there was lots more money allocated to barangay security and anti-crime efforts away from healthcare and other basic needs. And so COVID maybe will change that, but I think we have to see the connection between the poor response to how government resources have actually been used the past 4 years.
All right. Did you want to jump in with another comment, Professor Abinales?
No. I think it's a campaign issue, and then once things normalize, as Sheila pointed out, government resources then shifts to counterinsurgency and anti-drug operations of the local government. Yeah.
All right, so since we've got just over 10 minutes left, I'm going to go ahead and shift over to some of the international questions, since there are a plethora of them coming in. So I'm going to ask the first one, which I think perhaps may be the most straightforward and is not tied to a particular country, but how important will overseas voting from overseas Filipino workers be in the next election? Will issues of concern to overseas voters be a particular electoral party platform, or do you think that they're going to be more marginalized?
I think it's like the Irish Americans sending money back to Ireland. I think they're going to send money back and rely on their families' decision to whom to vote. This is not the voting bloc in the same way that Indian expatriates are, and these are communities, overseas Filipino communities, that are not really tuned to national politics, but local politics. Okay. And so there is going to be it's going to be dispersed. They'll probably support one president, but for most part, if they are politically active, it is in support of the governor, the congressman, the mayor.
I think I will object a little bit to that, because 2016 really saw the mobilization of overseas workers by Duterte and the Marcoses, right? Using a lot of social media money and everything, and organizing actually on the ground. We've seen here in the US, both the Duterte and the Marcos forces have a head start, because they're there for the long term, I think, the Marcoses especially. And so we will see efforts between those camps to at least for some national candidates, but certainly for the Marcoses and for Sara Duterte, these same social media and Phil-Am groups that have been mobilized for 2016 will likely be mobilized again.
Yeah, but it's also possible that the money will be sent to help sustain campaigns. As I said, election campaigns have become more expensive now. In fact, if you look at the campaign for an advertisement campaign of Senator Go in 2019, it was $8.31 million competing with Leni Robredo and Vice President when she was running for office. Her advertisement funds was 8.42 million. The problem is, now it's become more expensive. I've asked around people around how much does a ballot cost now. It's 5,000 pesos per vote. It was 1,000 pesos in 2016. And that 5,000 starting point, okay, cuts across different provinces, from war zone Lanao to Quezon City, I think where Sheila lives. And therefore, that money, every politician will be seeking support for that. And I think a couple of things. One, part of the budget for support will come from overseas Filipino workers. Second would be cuts from contracts, government contracts, especially infrastructure. The third would be illicit sector, because it's become extremely expensive. You have to diversify the source of funds, and OFWs most likely will, because we have $34 billion a year. That'd be a big source, no? It's a province, my province, for example, the conversation is you need to have 1 billion pesos to win in Congress. That's the $13.33 million. So I think Sheila is right, but it also, I think there's also the effort by different families from below to diversify the source of funds in order to win in the elections next year.
And still staying on sort of the international stage, I'm going to turn to the role of China, which is of great interest to our audience based on the fact that I think we've got 4 or 5 questions about China. So I'm going to combine a couple of these. Looking, throughout President Duterte's time in office, China's influence in Philippine political decisions has increased. So broadly, do you anticipate China being a strong influence in the coming presidential elections? And in the same vein, can you share any insights or thoughts on how Chinese stakeholders may seek to influence the elections and what type of tools Beijing may put into play, politically speaking?
Sheila.
Well, China will be an election issue, as I said. It may not be the main election issue, but certainly the opponents of whoever is the Duterte candidate, whether it's Sara Duterte or anyone, would use the West Philippine Sea, the South China Sea dispute as a point of attack. China is also a source of campaign funds, not over the table because foreign companies are not allowed to contribute to local elections, but certainly there will be money going into the coffers of both national and local politicians because China has immense stakes. In Manila, it's the online gambling. In Mindanao, it's mining and then all over the country, there's tourism. So certainly these Chinese companies or their Filipino partners would be contributing money to the election campaign. There were rumors that China or Chinese methods or Chinese techniques or Chinese support were helpful in the sort of social media campaigns in 2016 on behalf of Duterte. I don't know if that's true. Those are rumors, but certainly China does have the technology for this kind of how do you call it, disinformation, the arsenal of digital disinformation tactics that can be put to use by candidates. So I think those are the ways China can influence elections.
Yeah, I just must add to that. I think there is popular disdain for the Chinese, especially Chinese workers in the Philippines, but I doubt if it will reach the level as Malaysia in '64 or Indonesia in the '80s. There were made no anti-Chinese riots. Partly because the Chinese workers in the Philippines are focused on a particular sector, the gambling sector. And secondly, the source of Filipino revenues and family incomes are often from overseas Filipino relatives and the call centers. Second is, as I mentioned earlier, China is now competing with Japan as the second largest trading partner of the Philippines. And I think that is something that candidates will have to consider on. But I'd like it, the third thing that's really interesting is the way the Chinese is exerting their soft power. These are just a few examples. In 2019, Chinese government gave 80 Filipinos scholarships to go to China and take their PhDs and MA. Compare that to the US, only 37 Filipinos got scholarships to go to the US. You can count, I think by the 20s, the number of Filipino scholars working in the Philippines. There are 124 Japanese academics studying the Philippines. And the Chinese is actually starting the Philippine Studies program. There's only 3 Confucius Institute in the Philippines, Chinese government, but the 2 of them are in the University of the Philippines in Diliman, okay, and the Ateneo University, the top 2 universities in the country. Third, some of you may have remembered Irene Baviera. She passed away a year ago. She's known as the China expert of the country. The next China expert is actually this very young guy who is a PhD student in Wuhan University, fluent in Chinese. He's going to go back to the Philippines, be at the Political Science Department University, and be the expert. So the kind of soft power, I mean, Sheila is right. China is going to be involved in campaigns, in this campaign. But, you know, China is also thinking in the long term. That's always been China's attitude to countries it wants to study, you know. And so this soft power actually is going to have a long-term impact in terms of how Chinese and Philippine relationship would move forward. Yeah.
Giorgio, can I ask you about Chinese organized crime, especially Chinese connections to shabu and the methamphetamine trade? How is that going to play out?
Mindanao comes in here. The other thing about the Marawi crisis is Marawi was not just the center of Islamic resurgence, it's also where the best methamphetamine factories are to be found. Okay. And so in the past, in my hometown, heroin coming from Hong Kong are landed in my hometown in Osama City and processed at the other side, Llano del Sur. But now I think something has changed, meaning now you can produce methamphetamine in the very place. You don't have to export from China anymore. So the interesting thing then to question is, what kind of relationship have the Chinese syndicates shifted to vis-a-vis their Filipino partners? I'm not sure because of, you know, they outsource in a way the production of illicit drugs in the Philippines. So I can't, yeah, that's the latest information I have, Sheila.
All right, well, I think we are just about out of time. So since we've got 14 questions and comments left and certainly not enough time to answer them all, I think what I will suggest we do is I will share all of these questions and comments with our panelists, and some of them may have responses to share afterwards, and we can follow up with individuals in the audience who asked or post some answers on Twitter. So with that, thank you all for attending. I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Bill and to Hank Hendrickson for some closing comments.
Yes, thank you very much, Courtney, for managing the Q&A, and thanks to our guests for some lively discussion, which was very illuminating. Before we close, I'd like to ask Hank Hendrickson, Executive Director of the U.S. Philippines Society, for his comment.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Professors Abinales and Coronel. We appreciate very much this early preview of the election year in the Philippines. Just in looking back over the past hour, a couple of points that do stand out, related points, is really what wasn't said, what was not addressed by either of the panel presentations or in the audience questions that we were able to hear. And I think it's important because what we didn't hear was questioning of, will there be an election? Will the timetable stick or not? And as we look around the region and beyond, we see that the election timetables and then the elections themselves have been called into question. We don't associate that with the Philippines at this point. I think that speaks well of stability, predictability, issues of importance to the Philippines' foreign partners in business and government and strategic friends as well. The assumption is there'll be a an election that will lead to a transition to a new administration. And a related point is that looking back to the 2016 election campaign, there was a lot of talk about charter change that might lead to a change in the system of government to a parliamentary system that would have an impact on the ability for an incumbent to extend his term, her term. And that seems to have faded. I didn't hear any, and I don't hear talk about that happening in this next year. Now, we still have a full year to go, but it's really, in terms of what we hear from the Philippines, that's been diminished. And again, that argues for those interested in the Philippines to assume that there will be an election. We don't know what that election will, what the outcomes will be necessarily, but we do know that the structures seem to be in place. And the last point I would make is that thanks very much to the Southeast Asia Forum for this early election year preview. We look forward to having additional discussions where we can drill down as on details and as we see the candidate field begin to clarify. So we at the U.S.-Philippine Society look forward to being part of those discussions going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Hank. And now it is time for us to conclude. First, I'd like to extend our thanks to our two distinguished experts, Professors Sheila Coronel and Patricio Abinales. We hope, well, first of all, your discussion was fantastic and most, as I said earlier, most illuminating. I feel as if we've just begun to tap into this topic and your extensive knowledge of it. So I hope you'll think about coming back to join us as the campaign gets fully underway, and perhaps we can see where we stand in a future discussion. Second, thank you to the audience for joining us today and for asking such interesting questions, and to Courtney for managing the Q&A. I always, at the end of these events, I always ask our audience if you are interested in pursuing a question that didn't get asked. Rather than simply apologize to you, I offer you the opportunity, send me an email with the question. I'll go to our speakers and see if they can get you an answer. We do not want any question at the end of the day to go unanswered. Finally, thanks again to our partner in the roundtable, the U.S.-Philippine Society, Hank and Lucille. We really appreciate your good work in helping us put this together. To all of our participants, be sure to join us for the next Southeast Asia Forum seminar in 3 weeks, Wednesday, June 9th. We'll be discussing Indonesia's response to the climate crisis. Please also watch the Southeast Asia Forum web pages on the Stimson Center website for our next Philippines Roundtable meeting. We'll be following this 2022 election closely over the next 11 3/4 months, as well as other issues that are of interest to those of us who follow the Philippines. So until the next time, stay safe, get your shots, be well, and we'll see you